All right, hey, it's the Economancer back once again. We're going to be jumping right into it. This is Corruptible, Chapter 3, Moths to a Flame. So he starts off with the tale of Abraham Wald. And if you've ever taken an introductory econometrics course or some other later like statistical analysis course, you're going to be running into the story of Abraham Wald, which is basically he was working for the Department of Defense, a part of their statistical unit, and he was tasked to figure out how to get the planes from going down after being shot. And so they'd brought back so many of these planes, and they all had this pattern of bullet holes. And people kept saying, "Well, we need to patch up these spots where we're getting all these bullet holes." And he was the first one to really say, "Guys, I think you're wrong, because the ones that are coming back have that pattern of bullet holes, but that doesn't tell us what's happening to the ones that are going down. Obviously, these aren't going down with this pattern of bullet holes." So really awesome idea. But how does this play into this idea of power, corruption, etc.? Well, it leads to this author coming up with three questions, right? And so the first one comes from like applying this logic to your boss, right? Or whatever. Someone who has power over you, and this survivorship bias and how it needs to be explored. So first, who seeks power? Second, who gets power? Third is who stays in power. So these are three fundamental questions. All right. So let's kind of think about this idea of who seeks power. Does everyone seek power? Maybe, maybe not. We're not 100% sure, because again, power is kind of this subjective existence, right? Because it's not always who seeks power, it's who's being empowered by those who see this person display something. And I don't know why. Again, that part of the narrative, that power is an empowerment, gets set aside and focused on individual leaders and stuff like that, which again, I'm not convinced by the argument thus far that some individual has some psyche that leads them to being the one who wants the power, right? Which there are some, but not all individuals within leadership are that. All right, so that's the first question. Then, uh, and then we go into like who gets the power, right? Well, who gets the power, isn't that essentially who is facilitated by others to hold authority over the other people? And then third is who stays in power. And again, this is something that we talked about in the very first, or first part of the second chapter of the evolution of power, that it probably has something to do with the reciprocity of you scratch my back, I scratch yours, and this leads to stabilization of that individual who is empowered versus that authoritarian leader by himself holding on to power, because eventually he will be overthrown and someone who has a bigger base of support will be able to take that throne. And again, you can think of this as dictatorships, right? They don't really last that long, because by the time that instantiates itself into the social system, there's typically somebody there ready to stab you in the back, to Brute, or Stalin, or Lenin, so on and so forth. As soon as there was a time where people thought that, oh, this person's losing a little bit, boom, they were moving, they were rushing, they were making moves, and they were getting a base of support or a base of empowerment so that they could be the ones in power. All right, but I mean, it's an interesting way of looking at it, right? Looking at this survivorship bias, because it it does tell us that there are people who are seeking power and there are people who are not seeking power, but it doesn't tell us why some people get power. Um, so I think the second question and the third question could be a part of the survivorship bias, but I think it makes it a little bit more difficult. Now, the next one goes into the Cannibal Emperor and the Hyena Hierarchies. All right, so he says, flat out, who pursues power is not random. Certain types of people crave it and try to seize it for themselves. That produces a form of self-selection bias. Who perceives power is not random. All right, so again, this comes down to him not actively or methodically defining things. How is it not random, right? So if I grab 100 people, they're going to be randomly assigned. Some of them are going to be the ones who seek power. They are going to be in that distribution randomly. So people who seek power are just as random as those who don't seek power, right? It's a draw. All right. So that's, again, it's poor wording. All right. So certain types of people crave it and try to seize it. Yes, certain people crave and try to seize power. But again, that's one side of the power equation. What about the other side of the power equation on how they get power? Because it comes from the empowerment. All right, so we recognize self-selection bias easily in other aspects of our lives. For example, tall kids are more likely to try out for the high school basketball team than short kids. That's why basketball teams are never a random representative sample of the population. If you're only sampling from basketball teams, you will not be able to pull from the population. I agree. They are outliers of the population conglomerated into its own sample. But if you take the NBA as your population, then within it, it is random because it follows a normal distribution within that sampling population. And again, I think this is just poor wording. That you could say this better. You could come up with something that would alleviate this issue. You could be like, look, those who seek power come from the population. They are randomly assigned, but once they make that next step, they are no longer randomly assigned because they're in a different pool that is getting selected from. They're getting selected from people who want to be in power. And I guess that's what he's getting at. It's just jumbled. I could see how this kind of muddy the waters, but the idea here is, this is all about criticism. All right. So, certain traits cause some people to want more power than others. Too much attention is paid to the notion that power corrupts. Not enough attention is paid to why corruptible people seek power. So this is what he's going into, right? And so this is a story of a woman he interviewed and her father. So this is Marie-France Bocassa. He was talking to her at a bistro near Gare Saint-Lazare in Paris, whatever that is, right? So they're sitting there talking, and he calls her the daughter of a monster, right? And so basically a Central African empire and Bangui, a destitute country you've probably never heard of, that was ruled by a ruthless tyrant you've probably never heard of, Jean Bedel Bokassa. So basically, he had usurped power from where he was at, spent a lot of the economy's money on making himself better off. When the French troops arrived, he was a cannibal. Turns out he was a cannibal, right? So they tried to interview him to kind of figure out what was the psychological mechanism going on with him. They really don't know. He died in 1996. So this guy's going out. Brian KLAAS is interviewing his daughter because he's trying to make this connection of whether he was corrupted by power or whether he was corruptible, and that once he got into power, he had to manifest that corruption that was already innate on his being, right? So this gets difficult, right? So what does she say? See, my only family identity was shaped by my father. I didn't know my mother, and my father put a mark on me like I was a part of the Bokassa brand. We have a powerful name. She doesn't want to change it. She thinks that the childhood lessons that she learned from her father were probably pretty good. They taught her to be strong. They taught her to manifest her own destiny, right? Um, and all of these things. And they talked about the problems associated with her father's childhood that could have led to all these issues. Um, and then it talks about the differences between her and her sisters and stuff like that, where some of them think he's an evil tyrant, but she's like, I don't think he was that bad. Whenever he wasn't in a fit of rage, he was a great dad or a good leader or something along those lines. And that the brutality that she's seen, she thinks that the power wasn't what changed him. She thinks he was probably like this most of his life, that she didn't actually see any changes in him, even though he acted out in this way. And he had some positive ideas and some flaws, just as we all do. And she talks about the things that she inherited from him that were good, and she also talks about the things she inherited from him that was bad, which she says that, she should be in power. Ooh. Anyway, so he goes on to genes aren't our destiny. Duh. Okay, so this is the argument of nature versus nurture. We have a nature where some have a natural predilection towards manifesting this behavior, something we've talked about, and then we have the nurturing aspect, the environment that manifests whatever that genetic composition is to trigger, and then we become what we were genetically predisposed to be. But it doesn't seem to work that way exactly. And again, this goes into some of the issues of psychopathy. There's some research that says we can all become psychopaths. Again, if you take the Piagetian model, developmental model seriously, that if a child doesn't play, doesn't learn these intricate details of moral foundations, by the time they're 4 or 5, they will come to embody this psychopathic tendencies. And that is a fundamental problem with things like borderline personality disorder. There's also trauma that can trigger these to happen down the line, such as PTSD has been known to trigger this. But essentially, we don't know. And he goes into, they've found a leadership gene through genetic testing. I think it was the University College London, now at Oxford University. In 2003, Deneve's team announced the discovery of what they called the leadership gene. They identified RS4950 as a bit of genetic code that's strongly correlated with ending up in positions of authority later in life. All right, cool. But again, that just tells you about leadership. That may not tell you so much about the relationship between leadership and corruption, because unless you're going to make the argument that they are the same, it just kind of leads you to assume the same. But okay. All right. All of these findings are overstated and misleading, is his next comment on all of the statistical modeling that he's going into on the genes and stuff. This is where it gets controversial. So I'm going to read this. If you're trying to find statistical correlations between genes and current leaders and say, the United States, the two most prominent genetic factors would be having a Y chromosome, being a man, and being white. It's not that white men are somehow better leaders, as we'll soon make emphatically clear, but rather that white men currently get into power more often than other types of people. All right, so let's actually think about this for a moment, right? So America, for hundreds of years, has been roughly somewhere around 90 to the current level of like 67% white. If that is the voting base, and if you have an in-group, out-group, preference, and let's say you have two individuals that have the exact same policy, and one is white, one is black, it is natural to vote for the person that looks the most like you, because you've come from a mostly homogenous line throughout your genetic and ancestral history. And so you have a preference for that. That doesn't, one, denote that someone's racist, but it can lead into racism. And two, it tells you that when people look, you have a much, much higher chance of pulling from that random population someone who is associated with that leadership gene, because they're going to have a higher distribution because they have a bigger number, right? Like this just makes sense. If that is the population, let's say 10% of the population has this leadership gene, and we have 67% of the current population being white, then that is a larger distribution of individuals, which means they're going to be able to occupy, just by being a larger demographic, those seats of power. And again, that doesn't mean that they're better or worse, but he will tell you emphatically clear that they are not better. Now, I wonder what would happen if he said the opposite, right? Because again, he keeps pulling from these places and then imputing the sin onto white people. And I find that mildly disgusting, to say the least. This imputation of guilt and sin needs to stop. All right. Despite these caveats, there's a good reason to believe that genes play an important role in human dominance. All right, again, we're making these dominance hierarchies, and you have to understand that when we're talking about dominance hierarchies, this whole frame of reference, this linguistification of the word dominance, is couched in Marxism, or better yet, neo-Marxism, which, again, the underlying definition of power here that's not being manifested and explained comes from the Foucaultian power, more so than like Parsons or Luhmann or something like that. And again, that's why he's not defining things, because if he actually defined it and laid it out, then people would be a little bit more likely to push back against some of this. And he says, after all, we are animals, and genes play a role in determining leadership in other species. All right, so controversial statement on my behalf. I am a Christian. It's pretty clear. I don't view humans as animals per se. I think we have biological tendencies that are rooted in the evolutionary byproduct of our human civilization, but I don't think that we are necessarily animals. And I think conscious beings can be separated from beings that are unconscious, that survive wholly on simple cognitive tasks, as well as no narrative. They exist on the intuitions only, whereas humans can intuitively and rationally come to different decisions, and that's that separating factor. So just calling us just animals is patently false, at least from my perspective as a Christian. All right. Here comes a joke. The world is complex. Genes clearly matter, but they aren't the only thing that matters. We can't conduct similar experiments on humans because of these pesky things called ethics. Right? And he's talking about mice experiments and stuff like that, where we can't experiment on humans because we have ethics. It's like, what? Well, we have ethics, and we have ethics because we find that humans are divinely inspired beings, and that we can empathize and sympathize with them at a higher level than we can with mice. So it would make sense that we wouldn't want to experiment on them by, like, I don't know, the Nazi experiments that were done that everybody kind of agrees were absolutely horrible. Should we dispense with that because of pesky ethics? And I get it that it was probably a tongue-in-cheek joke, but again, you're writing a book about corruption and bad people, and imputing sin and imputing, all of these negative interactions onto people, and then saying stuff like this just makes me shake my head and go, there's a time and a place for jokes, but this probably wasn't it. And this is probably not the book to make a joke about ethics and experimenting on people when you're trying to talk about people that are cannibals. Like, it's just, all right. So next is, how do we deal with this issue, right? Of people self-selecting themselves into power, which the whole argument being laid out here about genes and stuff like that, and that these genes are part of the self-selection policy, and then whatever the manifestations of the nature is, that's what self-selects them. It's not really laid out very clear, but I don't think it really needs to be, because the crux of the argument here is, can we as humans make it more or less likely that good people will seek power? All right, so this is the statement. Can we tweak recruitment policies or change perceptions of what kinds of people should be in control to ensure that gentler, kinder people start to self-select and throw their hats into the ring? So first, this conflates hierarchies. You can be a tyrant on a small level, or you can be a tyrant on a grand level. In fact, there's probably a lot of friends groups that have that one guy that everybody thinks is a jerk and who's tyrannical, but they still hang out with him and they still like promote him to some type of leadership within that little friend group. Even if it's not a direct leadership position or something like that, they still know that his opinion's going to weigh heavily on the group dynamics. And some people can be perfectly happy with having just that level of power and not need to motivate it more. And that would mean, all of these things. All right. So what does that kind of lay out here is, first of all, you should not be tweaking public perceptions, and recruitment policies. That's just fundamentally incorrect, right? So this is an argument against stuff like Richard Thaler's work on nudge. I am opposed to nudge theory. I think a good bit of social scientists don't really talk about this much, but to try and change people's minds without their consent, I think is fundamentally wrong. People do not consent to you changing their perceptions in any way. And so when you do that, you are tyrannical yourself. So you're saying to deal with tyranny, we must be tyrannical. Let's hope that Brian KLAAS doesn't get into positions of power, because he's made it very clear that he is not above propaganda and brainwashing to change people's minds so that they don't go into positions of power, but people who do not seek power will go and seek power. This is mind-blowing to me. And this right here made me almost put down the book, because this level of contradictory belief is just, it's crazy to me. And I see it constantly from, I guess you could call them like social justice warriors and stuff. These are people that, I want the world to be a better place. Well, how do we do it? Well, we have to destroy it and rebuild it. Like, what? That's not the way this works. You can't negate. Oh, okay, let me think of it. Let me try to play it this way. Okay, so let's say you live in a bad world. You don't want to make it worse, and then by making it worse, somehow assume that it will become better, because it's an additive property. A negative plus a negative is still a negative. Now, a negative times a negative is a positive. I get that. But this is an addition. This isn't a multiplicative issue. And that right there is just mind-blowing to me. Anyway, so the next section gets a lot more in depth. I have far more notes on it, so I'm not going to go into it. So it's from Maori teens to M113s, M1113s, and then it goes into Arizona autocrat. So there's the next two sections of chapter 3. This kind of lays the foundation for the selection problem. Then it kind of lays the foundation for the genetic or the nature versus nurture argument, and how we look at social dominance and stuff like that. And then where we go from here is leading into this motivating belief that we can change how people interact with the world and make it better. And it's going to be looking at the George Floyd issue. Then it's going to be looking at other problems associated with police. And then the Arizona autocrat's going to be looking at homeowners associations, which are terrible. HOAs are just a terrible idea. But if you sign a contract, you go into it. And that's going to be the big conversation here. But that's the end of my video. So I'm going to give you a quick breakdown of some of the things that are coming out soon in the video that's coming after this one. That one will be a short 5-minute video to kind of lay down some more stuff that's going to be coming in the future. Please like, share, subscribe. If you have any questions or comments about what was going on in this book, please lay them down below, and have a good day.